Thanks everyone here, and also to the virtual attendees as well. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit about the cybersecurity side of things, specifically in the startup space. So a little bit about Tech Superpowers and a little bit about me. So I'm Michael O. I'm the president and founder of Tech Superpowers. So we've been in the Boston area for 30 years. I started the company as a freshman at MIT. And of course, back then, cybersecurity was barely a thing. In fact, at the world's biggest technical university at MIT, they had social security numbers on your ID cards. That's how bad it was back then. So, of course, the hackers at MIT sort of highlighted very quickly how that was a bad idea. And that was sort of the era in which I entered the workforce as a freshman, helping people with IT issues and getting people on the internet. So we've been doing that for 30 years, and now we're really focused on the Boston startup ecosystem. But let me, before we go too much further, let me introduce Adam, who can talk a little bit about what we do currently in our company.
Yeah, of course. So really kind of starting out, when we talk about who Tech Superpowers are,
Introduce yourself.
TSP, we'll get there.
Okay, all right.
My name is Adam Fisk. I'm the director of IT services. We are a managed services provider. We're an MSP, TSP. We'll use these terms interchangeably today. But when it comes down to it, what we are more just than the heartbeat of your IT, more than just saying, hey, I'm locked out of my email. Hey, I forgot a power adapter. We do so much more. And everything that we're doing is really under that lens of cybersecurity, from onboarding and offboarding, when people are coming and leaving your organization, to building out your IT and AV infrastructure. Each one of these things has to really be focused under cybersecurity, because as we'll talk about today, is by not identifying and not focusing on these really in that intro period, you're creating risk, you're kind of punching holes in your infrastructure's security posturing. So when we're really talking through everything that we're doing today, this is who we are: cloud migration, build outs, monitoring, really cybersecurity. We'll kick it to Mike for who do we serve?
Sure. So we've been in this ecosystem for 30 years, as I said, but really most recently is when we've been focusing in the startup side of things in the Boston area. And part of that's because we realized we were already servicing a big number of companies that were part of that ecosystem. So a lot of our companies, as I mentioned, are startups or scale-ups. And a lot of them are funded either by grants, private equity, Series Bs and Cs. Together, our current client base, the ones that we're servicing every day on a day-to-day basis, have raised over $344 million in funding themselves. And then we've also done the other side of it. Some of our clients are on the investment side, investment portfolios with 1.4 billion assets under management, and investors in 11 different companies themselves. And so when we look at what startups need from a cybersecurity standpoint, as well as what investors are looking for from a risk mitigation standpoint, we've seen it on both sides. And we're here to share, hopefully, some of our experience and some of the lessons that we've learned along the way during the talk. As part of that 30-year history, we've had the sort of honor and privilege to work with some of Boston's biggest brands. These are generally IT or AV-related projects, including the Boston Celtics, Accel, Matrix Partners, Kayak, some big names. So we've also worked within larger organizations as well with all kinds of infrastructure. So a quick little poll, and this is not just for those in the room, but also virtually. Where are you on your startup journey for those that are kind of in the founder side of things? Are you pre-seed or seed? Raise your hand. Okay, great, thanks. Oh. Excellent. Early Series A, anyone in that stage? Or in the growth side, B and C? Okay, so great. We have a pretty good skew towards the early side, which is perfect, because I think what we are going to be talking about today are things that you should be thinking of and should be thinking about, even in the earliest stages, because cybersecurity is much easier to implement on a small scale As soon as you start scaling and as soon as certain things start just having a momentum of its own, you're having to correct a lot of things. And that's kind of what we want to push against if we can. So what does a startup need to be secure? The word security, and particularly in the reference of cybersecurity, is a very fuzzy term. And I'm sure as you see the word cybersecurity being thrown around in today's marketplace, everyone says they have a cybersecurity tool, a cybersecurity solution, a cybersecurity service. Our job is not as a cybersecurity sort of startup or tool provider. We consider ourselves more of a curator of tools, process, and all of the different things that come into cybersecurity and looking at it holistically and providing that consulting for our customers so they understand what it means. But if you're a startup, and as we were seeing, many of you are sort of on the earlier side, well, what does it mean to be secure, right? I mean, some of it's very common sense stuff. But as a startup, we should assume success. As a startup grows, how do we define security? Well, one way to look at it is, what do people say you need, right? As you grow as a startup and you start servicing enterprises, as you start servicing medical companies, as you start servicing financial companies, or maybe even federal government agencies, there's a whole host of alphabet soup frameworks out there. I'm sure many of you have heard of these: SOC 2 Type 2, HIPAA, HITRUST, FINRA, all of these things, and they all have cybersecurity elements that are part of it. Of course, many of these frameworks are around privacy. In some cases, it's really just making sure that the federal government, for instance, has the right type of cloud service providers that have the right pieces. There's many pieces to each one of these things, but there's a cybersecurity element that it pervades through all of these frameworks. And if you look at the sort of the details of these frameworks, many of them are really defined by policies. They're not telling you how to do something, but they're telling you what you need to have. So the policy may say something like, your passwords must be secure and stored in an encrypted format, right? Or all your workstations must be encrypted. But there's a process, right? In order for you to do that yourself, of course, maybe if it's on your own personal computer, there's a process of set of steps to take. But as you have an organization and as you're scaling that and as you're growing that, and particularly if we assume success and you grow quickly, you need to have a process in place where this process can be very consistently applied as you grow, machine after machine, employee after employee, that you have these processes in place, right? So the frameworks provide a set of policies. It's your job to put together the process to address those policies. And if you look at sort of at a high level at many of these frameworks, and like I said, they all kind of have a different take on the world, whether or not it's data privacy, cybersecurity, sort of compliance, they all drive towards a sort of a common set of things. And this is not even all of them, but if you look across what each one of these compliance frameworks is asking you to do, they're all essentially driving to the same kinds of activities, processes, and policies. For instance, configuration management, right? It is a term that we use within the IT world to say, if you have a fleet of computers, what are you using in order to deploy a change of your configuration? So when you decide that you need to encrypt something, or let's say you're working for the federal government and they decide that suddenly everybody needs a new version or higher level of encryption on all the laptops or all the devices that are part of your company, how do you deploy that configuration, right? So has to be software that manages this, right? Password policies, multi-factor authentication, those are always parts, if they're not explicitly stated in the framework. There's a lot of how they kind of define the compliance that really drives you towards implementing specific password policies or multi-factor. And security awareness training, almost a mandatory for any one of these frameworks. It's very important as you're going through these compliance sort of frameworks to be able to prove that you're doing digital security training and doing it consistently, once again, that you have a process to do that. And one of the final requirements that you'll see across many of these frameworks is defining a security contact, right? Somebody who's responsible in your organization in the case of a cybersecurity incident, right? And that person needs to be able to understand not the technical side of it, but certainly from a process standpoint, what you're doing as an organization to protect the organization. And you're the one that's going to be responsible in order to, fill out the paperwork of what happened to that incident, the privacy implications of all that. So there needs to be somebody assigned as that security contact that can really sort of look at the whole set of cybersecurity defenses that you're taking and how it all fits in with your organization. So we can talk a lot about what makes a startup secure, but let's talk about what happens if you do nothing. And I put this slide in, we put this section in, not because we're sort of saying this is wrong, because every startup in its journey is doing nothing at some point, right? You do not have a CISO when you're two people in a garage developing a product. When you're trying to find product market fit, cybersecurity is not your priority. So at some point, you're going to be not worried about cybersecurity, compliance, and all these things. But as you grow, you need to start thinking about it. And when's the right time to think about it? That's sort of the thing that we're trying to look at. But let's see, what happens when you're doing nothing? Well, within our industry, it's what we call shadow IT, right? And it's simply defined as IT without centralized coordination. And of course, like I described, that bootstrapped startup, just starting to put together a product market fit, develop a few things. It's not on your immediate focus to make sure that all your laptops are encrypted or you have configuration management software. But what ends up happening over time as you go from 2 to 5 to 10 is you start getting a random smattering of devices, and you start getting those devices with outdated software, right? Because you've gone to Micro Center, and you say, well, I'm hired 2 people, they're starting next week, let me just grab a couple laptops. Okay, well, this one looks like a good deal. That one's from Dell, that one's from HP, and I've got a Lenovo, right? And then you don't have any software that's on there to sort of say, oh, well, what versions of the operating systems, the patches, the software that's running on it, are we running? Are we making sure that's all the latest versions? You also, as part of this bootstrap sort of phase, you're signing up for services ad hoc, right? One day you may decide, hey, well, I've got Google for my email. I need Lucidchart to be able to share some process documents with somebody else in my organization. And then you go out and you take your personal credit card, or maybe if you have a corporate card, you just pay for an individual license. And then somebody else in the organization, so at some other time, has that same brainwave. They sign up for their own Lucidchart account. But you don't actually set it up in any organized, centralized fashion. So even though Lucidchart, as an example, has a Teams-based license where you have control over the data, so if somebody leaves the organization, that data automatically gets transferred to the administrator. Instead, you just have a smattering of random licenses that have none of those, sort of systems set up, right? The other thing that happens as part of shadow IT is when you work on something, when you fix something, when you secure something, those fixes are not necessarily documented. You don't have a central repository for institutional knowledge around IT and cybersecurity. You're just fixing something. And we see this all the time. Startups by nature, especially nowadays, are highly technical organizations. You have people that are developers, you have founders that are highly technical, engineering, and they're very capable of fixing their own stuff, right? Which is fine when you're 2 or 3 people, but as you start to scale, as you start to work on these same problems over and over again, you find yourself fixing the same issues and reinventing the wheel every time those fixes happen, because there's no central repository for how things are being done. And most importantly, a lack of consistency as you're growing basically means no security, right? And as I've said before, every startup goes through the journey at some point and doesn't have that consistency. But if you make the mistake of retaining that lack of consistency for too long as you grow, then you're going to find yourself in a position where you're going to have to institute a lot of these frameworks and a lot of these policies and processes sort of retroactively. And it's much harder to do that, even in a company of 20, to go back and make sure all your systems are encrypted. They have all the software, and that you've tracked all of your assets. Well, so why is it bad? I mean, I've kind of given you a little bit of a taste of why that's bad. But from a cybersecurity perspective, the critical things are no one really owns anything. right? If you have individual licenses of a random smattering of SaaS services, you don't have a central repository of where all that critical data. I mean, presumably all these services contain, essential sort of, information about your business. They may, have code. They may have molecular information. They can have whatever your business in. It's all digitally based. And you may not necessarily know where that data is living because now you have independent, people within your organization that have all signed up for lots of different services. And one of the essential things around all of these frameworks is you need to know and define what your critical data is and where it lives. And you have to make sure that it's either backed up and encrypted. That's a big piece of all of these compliance frameworks. Most essentially, when somebody leaves the company for good or bad reasons, if somebody's terminated, especially, there's not a process for offboarding. Those licenses for those services are individually owned. They might be on different credit cards, and you don't have any control over that data. Of course, that means things like redundant costs, paying for services twice, but the real cost is to your business not necessarily knowing where your very, very valuable information, your data, is actually being stored. And that creates a lot of vectors for malicious acts, right? And those malicious acts could be that somebody has simply put something in an Amazon S3 bucket and not secured it properly, and then somewhere down the line, somebody else finds it, right? That's huge, risk for your organization, if not from the standpoint of what that data is, but reputationally, right? We've all heard of those stories of small businesses and large businesses sort of losing their data to an Amazon bucket that's wide open. You also are vulnerable to insider threats, right? If you have no centralized IT and you have somebody who leaves the organization in a scenario which isn't particularly favorable, there's lots of different ways they can take that information, with them, and they can leverage that. The classic example is sort of a salesperson that leaves with all of your CRM data, but there's so many other ways that kind of data exfiltration that's done by an insider can be extremely damaging to your business, right? And so once again, that sort of sense of this shadow IT creates risk. And it seems very reasonable to have that risk when you're 2 or 3 or 4 people. But as you grow, and some of the clients that we've dealt with went from 7 people to 400 over a course of a 12-month period, that's when you really lose control if you don't have the right sort of centralized IT and cybersecurity process in place. So I'm going to hand it over to Adam. He's going to talk about the 4 pillars of securing your startup.
So we've talked a lot about the shadow effect that we have to be focusing on. So what can we actually do to secure that, to prevent that, to fix that? Really, if we're thinking about these things in bite-sized pieces, it's really just 4 pillars. That's the easiest way to start. Granted, as you start breaking these apart, it will become infinitely more complicated. You'll need more resource, you'll need more time. But really, to begin, the most important thing is really just focusing on these 4 places. And really, to begin, it's the easy one. It's tools. Tools are easy because they're things that you can really buy off the shelf. Everybody already is paying for a whole bunch of tools, SaaS applications to get work done. But when we're thinking about securing our organizations, we're talking about protective tools. We're talking about those initial layers. And a lot of these things are obvious. They're the things that we kind of already know. Maybe we don't want to do it yet because of time, cost, complexity, or it's just not the important thing at the time. And really the easiest one is antivirus software, anti-malware software. That is on every single workstation now. Doesn't matter if it's Mac, if it's Windows, maybe sometimes even our Linux systems. This is that no-brainer system. Now, when we think about trying to combat against shadow IT, about that complex costs and who's watching what we really mean is centrally managed antivirus. It is not just going and buying 10 licenses on 10 credit cards. It is buying 10 licenses in one business account. So that way, when something does happen and an alert is fired, it's going to a single place that can be identified and followed up upon. I'm going to skip the next one because that's a little bit of a weird one. But the other one that is really obvious and we know inherently, even on our personal accounts, is some sort of email filtering. We are bombarded by spam every single day. I send spam in some ways because I'm asking people just to do something, and they say, nope, this is garbage, and I'm going to delete it. But how can we at least prevent the things that are malicious in act, the things that are looking to take that next layer and open up our risk profiles? It's phishing, it's spear phishing, it is sending the bogus documents. It's the pieces that are actually the most important thing for you to be focusing on now, because it is the greatest and rising trends around malicious attacks on our organizations. COVID and work from home, hybrid working really shone a light on this, because the successes of those attacks rose dramatically over the course of a few years. So starting by putting in some amount of filtering in your organization to add in that line of defense so they don't even hit your employees' inboxes. We talked about multi-factor authentication. If you tune out the rest of this talk, just turn on multi-factor authentication. You will not get cybersecurity insurance anymore if you don't have MFA turned on your core accounts. Start by your email. Start by your data storage. If you have a Dropbox account, if you have a Box account, Google, Microsoft, it doesn't matter. Turn it on. The good news is you're about to be forced to do it anyways. All these different vendors want to prevent their risk of being in the news of saying, hey, another account got hacked. So they're going to force it in on you anyways. And then password management is kind of twinned in on that. It's very easy for us to sign up for accounts on accounts on accounts, or it's our first day at a new organization and you have 10 invites in your inbox. Hey, maybe I was already given a password. I'm just going to use that same thing 10 times. Don't do it anymore. Stop it. 10 different passwords, because that will be changing your bad day of getting that email and saying, hey, we're sorry your data got leaked. Go change your password now, to a bad few minutes because you only have to change one, not 20. And the last one is really focused in on our organizations that are starting to establish a more physical footprint. Even if you are a hybrid forward organization, if you have that central office where you're operating at least some amount of the time out of, you'll want some sort of hardware-based firewall. Because all of these things that we're talking about are layers of protection. We want to prevent against intrusion, against kind of that attack coming from the outside. But this also protects our hybrid staff, because if they're traveling, if they're even just working from home and want that extra layer of protection, VPN to a known good firewall system is a fantastic way of doing that. So each one of these things, what are they doing? It's the idea of defense in depth. The easier way of thinking about it is the Swiss cheese approach to security. Let's think of the stereotypical cartoon piece of Swiss cheese. It is a square that has a whole bunch of holes in it. Every single one of these things will have a hole. It doesn't matter if it's a firewall, which maybe has a 0-day issue, or an email that slips through our spam filters. Each one of those, something is going to slip through. But by layering each thing on top of each other, we're covering up as many holes as possible, so that we can do as much as we can to prevent against those known attacks, against attacks that are happening en masse, because each one of these things will not be sufficient enough on its own. Multi-factor authentication is great, because what if our password gets hijacked? What if they get through that? Okay, well, we keep on doing these little things to help prevent ourselves from, again, having a bad day and probably a bad month. So the next one is process. It's the one that actually is the most important thing. We did the easy thing. We took that day, we created a whole bunch of these tools, we signed up for them when we said, hey, staff, go and do this now. That's a process. Good process is everything. Proper documentation is the most important thing. And that really is the only way that an organization can scale in a good, efficient manner. We can go from 10 to 50 in 2 days, but every single person will get completely different things. We went through and, as an organization, identified that the checklist manifesto was the next thing that we needed to do to really unlock our next stages. We also partnered that with the idea of the 1,000 SOP project, SOP being standard operating procedures. We identified and looked down and said, okay, we're doing essentially the same things every day. But all 20 of us, all 30 of us are doing it in our own different ways. You can kind of almost see the fingerprint of every single person doing it in a different way. That lack of consistency, as Mike mentioned, breeds issues. It kind of opens up that risk. So why don't we all just do it the same way? Why don't we write down each of the steps that we are going through in easy to follow standard operating procedures, easy to follow SOPs, so that if somebody just wants to take a vacation, somebody needs to be sick and not work, somebody else can pick up that SOP and know exactly what to do and do it the right way and the same way as every time before that. These SOPs, these checklists are key because they are regularly updated. If someone's following an SOP and that step doesn't make sense anymore, everybody should be empowered to update it or at least flag it and say, hey, this doesn't make sense anymore. I'm not sure where to start. When we are at TSP configuring and building up our SOPs, the idea is that we want any single person in the company to be able to pick it up and know what to do. It doesn't matter if they're a technician, in marketing, in HR. If it's kind of that red alarm moment, everybody should be able to pick it up and at least understand what's going on. There we go. So what really this does is this helps shine a light on shadow IT. If everything is documented, if everybody is going through and configuring these accounts in the same way, that will reduce those situations where somebody goes and says, oh, but I like Miro, not Lucidchart. I'm just going to sign up for a Miro account. No, we're a Lucidchart company because that's in our standard operating procedures. Maybe we have a change management system where someone says, hey, Miro is actually really great for these reasons. Fantastic. Let's update our SOPs. Let's update our checklists. That's going to reduce errors. We're going to not see those fingerprints of everybody kind of doing things in a different way. And somebody gets their laptop and half the software isn't installed because they're just invites waiting for you. And it scales well. So we've been very lucky to work with some organizations, as Mike mentioned, that went from like 8 to 10 people to 400 in a year and a half. Sometimes those onboarding classes were 40 people in a week. The only way that we were able to do that successfully and efficiently is by going through and having a consistent system across every single user, dependent on what that user should get. Your SOPs should be specific to the user type. Finance doesn't need engineering. Engineering wicked doesn't need HR. So what can we do to make sure that they're customized per individual, per role? And by doing this consistently, you will create that culture of SOP-focused employees where everything's being followed, everything's being consistently updated and created, especially when we're doing something new for the first time. Which brings us to training. We are going through, we've built up all of these SOPs, we've purchased all of these tools, we have created additional layers of defense. But when we start talking about security, when we start talking about securing our organization, unfortunately, the weakest link of every single person, every single organization is the one-time oops moment. It is the people, because we are stressed, we're busy, we're taking things sometimes at face value. We really, really recommend, and please, create some sort of security awareness training, a culture of security awareness training. There are tons of various digital resources out there. We happen to work a lot with KnowBe4 as an organization, which allows both a testing and training component that can be done completely virtually. But every organization, really every employee, is going to have their own learning style. Some people are at tactile. Some people really need to talk it out. So looking at all of these things to understand how it is best for your employees and creating that consistent system will make it so that when that weird email comes through and it slips through the spam filters and they see it, and it's from the CEO that says, hey, go buy me 50 gift cards tomorrow, that they say, oh, that's probably not real because there's no way that Mike will tell me to go buy 50 gift cards tomorrow. It's creating that system where somebody can raise their hand and create what we also call the groundhog effect. Someone says, hey, I got this weird email. Did anybody else? They fire it off in Slack. Someone's like, oh, me too. Or someone says, oh, Mike is on a plane. He definitely wouldn't ask you to do that. It's creating that culture of healthy skepticism, of understanding that maybe not every request that we're seeing is valid and should be acted on. That is truly only found by creating also a no shame structure to training, reviewing the misses, reviewing the active attempts. So that way, when something happens, when somebody does make a mistake, we look at it and say, well, was this just a really advanced phishing technique? Sometimes it is. And that is allowing the rest of staff to understand and be aware of it. And it creates a system where if somebody does click on that link, it happens, but they don't try to hide it. They don't try to say, oops, it wasn't me. And then that level of time kind of extends. This is social engineering. This is protecting against social engineering. It's saying, hey, I looked on LinkedIn, I looked on the website, I know Mike's your boss, I'm going to send it to them. And I'm going to say, hey, go buy those 50 gift cards. It also allows us to identify the weak links. By weak links, I do not mean people. I don't mean departments. I mean styles. Maybe SMS is the weak link because we are an organization that is very text heavy. Or maybe it is the email that comes through that is kind of phrased in the right way and starts to build off. Preventing by that, creating that system, and what we at TSP tend to call the 2-key culture is building. By 2 keys, we mean it's kind of the movie, like the missile room, you have to pull one key and then the other person has to pull the other in order for something to happen. I got this weird email. Should I do it? No. I got this weird email from Mike. Oh yeah, Mike's on a plane and he actually does need gift cards. This is the one time I'm going to say yes. It allows us to be able to, again, add that additional layer of defense. And the most important thing, like with training, it's our people. The right people, it will be the make or break. You have to have somebody that is responsible for our security posture, our policies, our processes. With us, a lot of the time, especially in early stage or like right in that growth point, it's HR. It's the people that know what the founder's visions are, where we're going, and they know what's happening. So they have that authority to say, yes, let's do this, or no, you can't. It's imperative for us as organizations, be it TSP being 30 years old or you who may be only 7 months, to identify who those resources will be, not only internally, but potentially externally as well. At the end of the day, there has to be somebody that has been canified that can say no. And most importantly, that shouldn't be you. It shouldn't be the founder, because sometimes you have to be told no. What these individuals will be doing is retaining the value of your business. Mike mentioned previously that when an attack happens, you kind of have 2 pieces. You have the monetary impact, but the reputational impact. This person is there to make sure that your value is protected on both sides of that coin. By saying no, it's not because they're saying, hey, Miro's a bad idea, or saying, no, we can't be an AWS company. It's not saying no for the sake of it. It's because there is a strategy, there's a policy, there's a process. They're the ones that will be responsible for all of these compliance and risk reduction activities. These people, especially in our early stage, are not necessarily the people that know what to do. They're not the ones that are turning the screw. They're not the ones that are shopping for vendors, but they're the ones that are identifying specifically that this is important and needs to be done. And at the end of the day, when an incident does happen, when someone gets through that perfect hole through every layer of our Swiss cheese, they're the ones that are empowered to say, this is what's happening. This is what's going to be done now. They are the ringleader. Again, the intent is not they are knowing every system in and out and what to do. It's that they have the SOP already written, and they are the person that is accountable to start that process. Because at the end of the day, someone needs to say no. This is the idea that, especially in early startups or sometimes startups that are 30 years old, if everybody is responsible, no single person is responsible, because everybody will be deferring for that first person to say, okay, you do this, you go say that. Or the worst case scenario is everyone starts at step one all at the same time and kick each other out. When we are thinking about our startups, when we're talking about our organizations and scaling, this can sometimes be the hardest thing to understand, is what happens and where to go next. Bringing in sometimes that outside resource, that consultant, can be the most important thing, because they sometimes bring that value of saying, this is what has worked well for other organizations. This has worked not maybe as well. And then you can take that and run with it. So at the end of the day, tools, process, training, and people, those are the most important things that you can do today to start securing your organization.
So what we want to do is sort of just at the end of this presentation, give you some really key takeaways, some next steps that you can take from each one of these 4 categories as you're sort of wherever you are on the startup journey, that you can come out of this and secure your organization or any organization you're working with in a better way. So the first one is around the tool side of it, right? Adam already mentioned that multi-factor authentication is very, very critical. And of course, many services are pushing people towards that, which is very good. But the first step in sort of understanding how you can secure all of these accounts is to catalog your SaaS vendors, right? I mean, of course, in this world, it's so easy to sign up for all these services, free trials that go into monthly and annual subscriptions. You end up in any organization with a whole smattering of these. And maybe an easy place to start is your credit card. Just look for those names on that credit card bill that you're getting charged every month, be it Google, be it Microsoft, be it Miro, Dropbox, etc. Understand what your SaaS vendors are, and then look and think about what that data is that lives in each one of those. For any SaaS vendor that has critical data in it, no matter how you define critical, it could be medical data, it could be just your financials, it could be simply just names of potential customers. You need to turn on multi-factor authentication for those critical services. Similarly, another tool to look at for everyone is password managers, and not just any password manager. Look for a password manager that has a team-based approach. One great advantage of a password manager in a team-based approach is it's a very secure way to share passwords between team members. So you no longer are texting people or putting stuff in email or whatever method that you've come up with for securely sending passwords. These password managers have a way of just saying, I'm going to create a secure vault that's shared between all the people in DevOps that has all the passwords that they need in order to access common systems. Of course, it's even better if you're using systems where everyone has their own login and password, but in a lot of cases, you need to still be able to share information, and that's where the password managers can come in. In the process side, we say start with 2 SOPs, which is what's your onboarding process and what's your offboarding process. And it's not just from a technical standpoint. It's not just, okay, this is where we're going to get the computer. This is the software that we're going to install on it. These are the things. You can use this across the technology side, but into HR. And it helps. It helps hugely to have a list of things that when somebody gets onboarded as an employee, that you're checking off every single thing. That may be setting up their account, their email, but also it could be other services that they're using. It could be simply make sure that they have a keyboard and mouse that ship with their laptop. That first day one experience of a new onboarded employee, I'm sure as you've heard, is so critical. It's that impression that they have. They've had 6, maybe 10 hours of interviews with you, but in their first day, they're going to work those 8 hours and they're going to have an experience. So you want to make sure that experience is perfect as much as you can. You want to make sure that laptop is to them. It has all the stuff that they want. They can dive in and start being productive. That's going to set them on a great path to be a great employee. And that happens through a great onboarding process. Similarly, do a great offboarding process. You're never going to just onboard people. You need to have a method by which you know which services to turn off very quickly, because in some scenarios, and we've all dealt with this, if you've run a company long enough, you have to terminate somebody and it happens very, very quickly. And you need to limit your exposure. And the faster you can do that, the better it is for your organization in terms of risk reduction. And the only way to do it quickly is by have a process that somebody can follow the directions. If you have to think about it, it's going to slow it down. So those are the two SOPs. So you don't have to be a 1,000 SOP culture. Just start with those two and always be updating. And of course, as you start that ball rolling, you'll start thinking of other things internally that you can put SOPs to and create more process. On the training side, we've already touched on it, security awareness training. There's companies that you can outsource that to that will do it digitally. You can develop it internally if you have very specific requirements around this. Create a channel, be it in Slack or Teams, to share security incidents. And it could be as simple as a phishing attempt. It could be a wire fraud attempt. It could be something that you just read about. And you're creating that culture of awareness about security, about vulnerabilities, about social engineering. And once again, create a little bit of time. It doesn't have to be a lot, but in team meetings, in town halls, just review those wins and misses. Make sure that people understand just as much as you're doing the high fives as part of your team meetings, recognizing great contributions, new people. Make sure that there's a little bit about security. Thank somebody for putting something in that channel that triggered oh, that's great. I mean, I got that too, and I'm very happy that you told me that. So it's very important to kind of have that sort of feedback loop about cybersecurity incidents, about phishing, et cetera. And then finally, on the people side, even if you're small, even if you're 3 or 4 people, designate somebody who's the primary person who's going to be dealing with security issues. That person may evolve over time. Of course, you're going to evolve that. And if you're a big company, it's going to eventually be a CISO, but you need that responsible party. That's part of their job description. It's going to be maybe a small part of it, especially if you're starting out small. And they're going to be that person, as Adam talked about, who's going to be responsible for dealing with an incident, doing some of the compliance and risk reduction things, and going through those checklists as we start putting them together. You're going to need to decide if you're going to build your IT and cybersecurity infrastructure or your capability and do it internally or externally. I think a lot of people, and like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people in tech startups just figure they're going to do it internally forever. And that's a pretty big mistake. I mean, at some point, as you can tell, when it comes to some of these processes, it becomes much less about a technical thing and much more about a process-oriented approach. And that's why IT departments exist, and that's why in companies like ours that you outsource that capability to exist as well. And I do sort of want to give you a little bit of a warning, which is don't make your DevOps people do IT, right? Once again, they're sort of responsible for keeping your infrastructure up and running for your service, but both from a standpoint of the value that they're providing to the organization, they may be highly technical, and yes, they can order a part, or they can get you a power supply, or they can fix a printer, or go underneath and a desk and do something. But ultimately, it's not good value for your business. And they're really two separate roles, right? At the end of the day, that IT role of making sure that as you scale, laptops are shipped out, have all the software configured, and all these types of things is a different type of role from a more traditional DevOps. And that's it. So those are our 4 takeaways. We have a QR code that has a download that has all of that information. So I did forget to remind people of that at the beginning, so everyone was taking pictures. But certainly take a photo of that. There's a nice download that kind of summarizes those takeaways, gives a little bit more information. And certainly we have time for some Q&A, both from the audience here as well as virtually. But one quick closing note, this is our first year here at Startup Boston Week. We had a great opening event, which was such a fun party. And we hope to see you, year after year here. And for those of you that are working on companies, we absolutely, wish you the best of luck. I've been on this journey for 30 years, and I know what kind of a fight it can be and the ups and downs of it. But there's nothing more exciting than running your own company. So we'll open it up to questions.
Thanks. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Having been put into a role with a startup-ish company that was already too far to have implemented all of these great suggestions, and having learned, I was chuckling over here over and over and over again because you kept bringing things up. That happened to us. That happened to us. That happened to us. We saw, fortunately, to no disastrous consequences. Sheer luck, to be honest, that there were no disastrous consequences. But I am now a huge proponent in starting with an outsourced firm, because you can't do it internally, I think, from the beginning, unless you have a huge amount of funding from the very beginning, because it gets away from you so fast. I had a couple of really specific questions. One was with regards to onboarding, and you kept using the Lucid chart example. I chuckled because that actually happened to us, and people were using different. Do you, as a firm, and firms like yours, also act as the manager for that type of organization? In other words, if someone came to me and said, I was in this role where people were coming to me and said, okay, how do I sign up for Lucid? And I say, well, you need to talk to, do you guys manage that type of process as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Easy answer, yes.
Yeah.
Harder answer is depends, because every organization is going to be a little bit different. The most important thing is just having somebody responsible for it. So with a lot of organizations that we work with, yes, TSP would be that person where they say, hey, I want a Lucid Chart license. And we say, cool, we already have a team account. Maybe we have some processes in place where we have to get approval from a manager, especially with like more expensive software. But yeah, we have been deemed the responsible party where we're adding, removing, editing, and sometimes being your advocate to the vendors. Lucidchart became the example because I've been on 100 different calls with various vendors, and Lucidchart happened to be the most recent, where we're saying, hey, let's rework this plan because we're getting ready for growth, or we have grown and our needs have now changed. But yeah.
Thanks. Second, and this is like a really detailed, specific, but part of the role as the had role creep. I would say the role creep kept growing. Was working my way through a cybersecurity insurance application and coming to the place where it says, "Do you have an SOP for this? Do you have an SOP for that? Do you have it set? Do you allow would working with you allow me to?"
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because the kind of easy way where we got so many SOPs is that we create them individually for each organization, because your onboarding is different than their onboarding. And your security plan and requirements, and really just your risk assessment, risk appetite, all of these various things are going to be so specific to you. So we would be able to create blueprints with you, playbooks, and then work with you to build them and test them and validate them and edit them, because this is your documentation and we're here to bring our experience and our expertise to kind of get them in that right way. And sometimes remind you of being like, hey, we really have to write this, or we really have to edit this because these things have changed. But yeah, we work with a lot of organizations of filling out. I know when it's a insurance renewal time, because we get a couple tickets asking for help and updates.
With 3 hours to go. 3 hours to the deadline. Yeah. It's due tomorrow.
Yeah. That's how it is. Yeah. So there's a question online of defining the DevOps role a bit more versus IT. When it comes down to it and we think about risk, we were talking about there's somebody has to be empowered to say no. You have to have separation of roles. If your DevOps team is there to build your environment, and we are there, and let's say we're using the agile flow and we have these minimal viable products that we're trying to do, and sometimes the easy answer is the best answer. If your DevOps role is looking at that and we say, hey, the easy answer is just make everybody an admin because I'll get less tickets, it'll be easier for me, and I'll be able to focus on what my role is. That's against our good security posturing, where only specific people should have admin and for specific reasons, and it's reviewed consistently. But it kind of goes back to sometimes somebody has to tell the DevOps team no when they're trying to do something because they know something else that's in the organization's future or in their MSAs with clients where they say, you cannot do this or you have to do this. So by having that separation, it allows the two teams to work really just better because each one has a focus, each person has a role, and you're not trying to split your brain in half of say, but I want to do this, but I can't do this because I was told not to by our cybersecurity insurance survey that we just completed with 5 minutes to spare. Yeah.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
So basically, I'm a founder, non-tech founder for a startup who has related to a lot of medical data. So it's kind of like the worst combination of all. And like we don't have a big team, like a people of 6.
Yeah.
So of course with limited budget, right? And so what's your suggestion? Like, what's the first thing for people like me that should be go to do right now? Like, what's the first thing? Because like sometimes even I would like to like consider about the security part. It was hard for me to understand like which was the priority to consider, and sometimes engineers say, "Nah, no, don't worry about it. We're not that important to be hacked." So,
Well, the first thing to do is not. I'll say the first thing to do is don't listen to those engineers, right? I mean, security, it is working its way so far down. You know, it used to be as a startup, you didn't really have to worry about it until you were 100 or 200 people, until you were working with banks, right? But we're seeing that from an insurance standpoint, you can't get certain insurances without having cybersecurity systems in place. We're also seeing that even medium-sized companies, if you're doing a contract with a medium-sized company, they're starting to also ask about the cybersecurity posture. I mean, I think I would probably say is just download that document because it is very oriented at very specific next steps that are not overwhelming. I mean, we're not asking you to fill out the HIPAA framework or high trust, and we have helped. You know, our companies, they are in the world of medical insurance, medical devices. We have helped companies go through that framework, and it's, you know, this many weeks, months, that kind of thing, just like SOC 2 Type 2. But I think the thing to do is just to take it in pieces. And if you start with understanding where your data is, I think once, because you probably don't think about it until you come to a talk like this, how many services do contain my data? Hopefully it's not too many, but once you start looking and turning over a few rocks, you'll realize it's in more places than you think, but it's not an impossible number of services or data collection areas. And then let's just make sure that that is secured. Let's make sure that it's not just one account with one password, which, by the way, was shared with somebody who left the company 3 months ago. Thinking through a few of those things just to start to kind of bolster and create that sort of the sort of walls in your fortress, right? It's really, coming to this talk, thinking about it, and then, taking some of those steps and just going down the checklist. So,
thank you.
sure.
Hi, question for me. So there's what you should do, which is obviously very valuable, and then there's what people or companies actually do. So I'm curious to learn, like, what is the most consistent motivating event that brings companies to tech superpowers? Is it a financing event? Is it the first enterprise customer, or some type of negative oopsie?
Thankfully, it's not the negative oopsie. I mean, I think we still haven't gotten to the point that the hackers are sort of going through and looking at who's been funded and let me target that company, right? I mean, I think the day will come. I mean, we're seeing they're spreading their automated tools and especially being enabled by AI to work en masse against lots of different targets. But I think it really is, that moment when they've taken those first steps and then they've kind of done it themselves, then they do get the funding. And okay, suddenly they say, all right, well, we're going to hire 10 people. And then that founder or DevOps person or just the lead developer who's been like provisioning one laptop every once in a while when they bring somebody on suddenly has to spend their entire weekend provisioning laptops when they should be like focusing on the code base or focusing on something else, right? That's the moment that they say, oh man, we need somebody else. And it is a little bit too late. I mean, we've come into situations like that where we've said, all right, well, let's just kind of rally the troops together and let's, figure out a deployment model. that's something that, because we've done it for so many other companies, it's come second nature. But that's probably the thing we're trying to get ahead of, is to sort of say, think about this a little bit before you get that funding. We're now in the position, like we work with Companion Ventures, which is local here in Boston, where we are doing a cybersecurity audit as part of their investment portfolio kind of, they're when they're looking to invest in a company, there's that risk mitigation sort of exercise, and cyber is now part of that for a lot of the investment companies. And when we look at cyber, we also look at IT process, and we go back to them as investors and say, look, they're going to have somebody in a role of a security officer, and somebody that's going to be managing their IT and helping to scale it. At this point, that's the smart thing for them to do, and they kind of put that into the roadmap. So we're trying to also get ahead of it on that side as well.
And the one thing I'll add is, for organizations, think of your value as the employee, the value as a founder, as the people officer. How much time are you spending on the little things around IT, the little things around security, and how much are you being paid? Is that worth that cost? That's a lot of the times where we start talking with folks. It's getting close to a breaking point where it's like, I'm not IT. I don't want to do this, but I'm doing it. It's like, okay, well, how much are you spending in terms of your time, both an emotional and monetary amount? What can we do to be a pressure release valve, and then kind of get ahead of the ramp, get ahead of the potential oopses, and look under rocks? So that's the one other thing to kind of keep in mind as you're building out teams of, is it time to look external? Is it time to bring in a consultant? What's that value, and what's the value of your time as well?